You don't stop for strangers in the rain because you're a saint. You stop because the guilt of driving past feels heavier than the exhaustion in your bones. But when Camille unlocked her rusted passenger door for a shivering old man, she didn't know she was unlocking her own cage. Camille's shift ended at exactly 11:14 p.m. The diner didn't officially close until midnight, but the manager had cut her early to save on hourly wages. It meant $14 fewer in her pocket for the week. $14 was exactly the cost of her daughter's off-brand asthma inhaler refill. She pushed through the heavy metal back door of the kitchen and stepped into the alley. The cold hit her teeth first. It was a miserable, relentless Pacific Northwest downpour. The kind of rain that didn't just fall, but seemed to seep up from the pavement, dissolving the edges of the city into a gray, freezing sludge. Camille pulled the collar of her thin denim jacket up, shivering violently as the dampness instantly bit through her cotton shirt. She smelled of rancid fryer grease, bleach, and stale coffee. It was a smell she scrubbed at every night, but it had settled into her pores, a permanent perfume of the working poor. Her car, a rusted 2008 Honda with a failing alternator, was parked 3 blocks away because she couldn't afford the diner's employee parking lot fee. She kept her head down, dodging the oily puddles that reflected the sickly yellow glow of the streetlights. Her boots were worn thin at the heels, and with every step, icy water wicked into her socks. She just wanted to go home. She wanted to peel off her wet clothes, check that 8-year-old Lily was still asleep in the living room pull-out bed, and stare blankly at the ceiling until her alarm screamed at 5:30 a.m. for her second job. She turned the corner onto Oak Street. The bus stops here were nothing more than rusted metal poles with a small, pathetic plastic overhang. Beneath one of them, practically swallowed by the shadows, was a figure. Camille's instinct was to put her head down and walk faster. The city at night was not a place for a woman alone to play Good Samaritan. The cynic in her, the part forged by missed rent payments, bounced checks, and men who promised the world and delivered nothing, screamed at her to keep her eyes on the pavement. "Not my problem," she chanted silently. "I barely have enough gas to get home." But as she drew parallel to the bus stop, a passing semi-truck hit a pothole, sending a massive sheet of muddy water flying toward the curb. It splashed violently against the plastic shelter and soaked the figure sitting on the metal bench. The person didn't curse. They didn't even move. They just sat there, taking the hit. Camille stopped. She cursed under her breath, a bitter, sharp expletive that tasted like defeat. She looked over. It was an old man, not the hardened, unpredictable type that usually haunted the downtown transit stops after midnight. He was dressed in a gray wool suit that might have been expensive 30 years ago, but now hung off his frail frame like a drape over a skeleton. He had no umbrella. A soaked felt fedora was crushed in his lap, his bare, liver-spotted hands gripping it with white knuckles. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his nose, off his chin, and onto his soaked collar. "Bus doesn't run past 11 on this route," Camille called out, her voice raspy from a 10-hour shift of asking people if they wanted fries. The old man slowly turned his head. His eyes were a milky, clouded blue, wide with a quiet, dignified panic. He was shivering so hard his teeth were audibly clicking. I missed the 4:14, he said. His voice was papery, breathless. "I've been waiting for the next one. Since 4 o'clock, Camille thought, a cold knot forming in her stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. It was 40 degrees out. The man had been sitting in the freezing rain for 7 hours. "There are no more buses," Camille said, harsher than she intended. She hated this. She hated the universe for putting him in her path. She hated that her conscience, buried under layers of stress and unpaid bills, was still annoying enough to make her hesitate. "Do you have a phone? Someone to call?" The man looked down at his ruined hat. "My son, but he is very busy. I shouldn't bother him." Camille squeezed her eyes shut. The rain drummed against her skull. She thought of the heating bill she hadn't paid. She thought of the Honda's gas gauge, currently hovering a millimeter above the E. She thought of her warm bed, mocking her from 4 miles away. "Christ," she muttered. She walked over to him, the water squelching in her boots. "Get up." He flinched slightly, looking up at her with wary eyes. "I'm not going to rob you. I don't think you have anything worth taking anyway," Camille snapped, her exhaustion stripping away any polite veneer. "My car is a block away. Get in. Let me take you home." The old man hesitated, his pride warring with his hypothermia. "I couldn't impose." "You're not imposing. You're freezing to death. And I'm not going to be the one who finds you dead on the news tomorrow. Come on." She didn't offer her hand. She wasn't a saint, and she didn't want to touch his soaking wet clothes. But she hovered close enough to catch him if he fell. He struggled to stand. His knees popped audibly, and he swayed like a felled tree. Camille instinctively grabbed his elbow. Through the sodden wool of his sleeve, his arm felt like nothing but brittle bone and cold skin. He smelled of wet dog, old peppermints, and the sharp, metallic tang of cold. "I'm Arthur," he whispered as they began the agonizingly slow, shuffling walk toward her car. "I'm Camille," she replied, her jaw clenched against the cold. "Don't talk, Arthur. Save your energy for walking." Unlocking the passenger side of the Honda was an ordeal. The lock was sticky, and Camille had to jiggle the key with numb fingers while Arthur stood beside her, swaying in the wind. When the door finally wrenched open with a metallic shriek, she hurriedly swept a mountain of crumpled fast food bags, a plastic dinosaur, and a pile of unopened red-stamped mail onto the back floorboard. "Watch your head," she commanded, practically shoving him into the vinyl seat. She sprinted around to the driver's side, dropped into her seat, and slammed the door. The silence inside the car was immediate and deafening, broken only by the rhythmic thrum of the rain on the metal roof. Camille shoved the key into the ignition. The engine whined, coughed, and finally caught, shaking the entire chassis. She cranked the heater dial to maximum. The vents hissed, spitting out a blast of air that smelled like dust and mildew. But it was barely lukewarm. Arthur sat rigidly in the passenger seat. He hadn't put on his seatbelt. His wet clothes were pooling water onto the cracked vinyl. Camille sighed, leaned over him, ignoring the intense smell of damp mothballs, and pulled the seatbelt across his chest, clicking it into place. "Address?" she asked, throwing the car into drive. The wiper blade squeaked violently against the glass, smearing the water rather than clearing it. Arthur rattled off an address. Camille paused, her foot hovering over the brake. Pinecrest Estates. It was a neighborhood 30 minutes in the opposite direction of her apartment. It was the kind of neighborhood where the houses were set back behind wrought iron gates, surrounded by ancient oaks and manicured lawns. The kind of place where people threw away perfectly good furniture just because it didn't match the new drapes. Camille gripped the steering wheel, the textured plastic biting into her palms. A surge of bitter resentment flared in her chest. Of course, she was risking breaking down in the middle of a storm, burning gas she couldn't afford, to drive a man back to a mansion. "That's a long way," she said flatly. I can give you money for the fuel," Arthur said softly. His hands were trembling so badly they blurred in her peripheral vision. He patted his pockets, his face falling. "My wallet. I think I left it on the kitchen counter this morning. I'm sorry." "Forget it," Camille snapped, merging onto the slick highway. "Just point out the turns when we get close." The drive was agonizing. The silence in the car was thick, heavy with the class divide sitting between the two front seats. Camille felt hyper-aware of her own poverty. She noticed the way Arthur's eyes scanned the dashboard, lingering on the pink envelopes of final notice bills she hadn't managed to sweep away. "You have children?" Arthur asked suddenly, his voice still shaky, but attempting politeness. He nodded toward a crushed crayon rolling around in the cup holder. "A daughter," Camille said. She didn't want to make small talk. She wanted to focus on keeping the bald tires from hydroplaning. It is hard work being a mother. "It's harder when everything costs money," she replied, the cynicism leaking out before she could stop it. "Look, Arthur, I'm glad you're not freezing on a bench anymore. But I'm not in the mood for life lessons tonight. Let's just get you home." Arthur fell silent. The rejection hung in the air. But Camille didn't care. She was too tired for grace. They finally reached Pinecrest Estates. The iron gates were open, flanked by stone pillars. Camille drove the rattling Honda up a winding, tree-lined street, the headlights cutting through the darkness to reveal massive, dark houses. "The third one on the left," Arthur murmured. Camille pulled into a sweeping circular driveway. The house was enormous, a hulking structure of stone and dark wood. But there were no lights on, not a single porch light, not a glow from a window. It looked abandoned, cold, and imposing. She shifted into park and kept the engine running. "Where is everybody?" Camille asked, looking at the dark facade. "You said you have a son." "He doesn't live here," Arthur said quietly. He unbuckled his seatbelt with clumsy fingers. He moved out some time ago. It's just me." Camille looked at him. Really looked at him. The expensive suit was frayed at the cuffs. The wool coat was missing a button. Despite the grand house, there was a profound, suffocating loneliness clinging to him, heavier than the rain. For a brief, terrifying second, she saw her own future reflected in his milky eyes. Old, discarded, waiting for a bus that was never coming. "Do you have your keys?" she asked, her voice softening just a fraction. Arthur checked his coat pockets. Panic flickered across his face, and then relief as he pulled out a heavy brass key. Yes, I have them." "Go straight inside. Take a hot shower. Drink something warm." Camille didn't know why she was giving him instructions. He was an adult. He lived in a house worth 10 of her lifetimes. Arthur pushed the car door open. The wind immediately howled into the cabin, bringing the icy rain with it. He stepped out, gripping the door frame for balance. He leaned back in, looking at Camille. "Thank you, Camille," he said. The sincerity in his voice grated against her cynical armor. "You have a good heart, even if you try very hard to hide it. Just close the door, Arthur. You're letting the heat out." He nodded, a faint, sad smile on his lips, and shut the door. Camille didn't wait to watch him walk up the steps. She put the car in reverse and sped out of the driveway, desperate to put the mansion, the old man, and the uncomfortable mirror he held up to her life far behind her. She didn't notice until she was halfway home that he had left his soaked, crushed fedora on the floorboard of the passenger seat. Morning tasted like copper and old sleep. Camille woke up to the sound of the radiator clanking, a useless noise, as the pipes remained entirely cold. It was 6 a.m. She had overslept by 30 minutes. "Damn it," she hissed, throwing off the thin quilt. The apartment was a tiny, one-bedroom unit on the second floor of a complex that had given up trying decades ago. The beige carpet was permanently stained, the ceiling sagged with water damage, and the walls were paper-thin. She walked into the living room. Lily was curled up on the pull-out couch, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, albeit slightly wheezy pattern. Camille paused, brushing a tangled lock of brown hair from the girl's forehead. The fierce, desperate love she felt for her daughter was a physical ache in her ribs. It was the only thing that kept her putting one foot in front of the other. Camille walked into the kitchenette, opening the fridge. Half a carton of milk, a wilting head of lettuce, and a plastic container of leftover diner fries. She pulled out the milk and sniffed it. Sour. She dumped it down the sink and grabbed a box of generic oatmeal from the cupboard instead. As the water boiled, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen. Incoming call. Greg Wallace, Property Management. Camille closed her eyes, resting her forehead against the cool veneer of the upper cabinets. She let it ring to voicemail. She knew exactly what Greg wanted. Rent was due 5 days ago. She had begged for an extension until Friday, promising that her tips from the diner would cover the difference. Greg, a man whose entire personality was built around enforcing late fees, had told her it was Friday, or an eviction notice on Monday. Today was Thursday. She was short by $200. She poured the boiling water into the oatmeal bowl and set it on the counter to cool. She needed an advance from her second job, cleaning offices downtown. She hated asking. Her boss there was predatory, always looking at her with a lingering gaze that made her skin crawl. But desperation was a master that demanded awful compromises. Lily stirred, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "Mom?" "Hey, Bug," Camille said, forcing a bright, entirely fake smile onto her face. "Breakfast is ready. Eat up. We gotta move fast today." "Is the heat broken again?" Lily asked, wrapping her thin arms around herself. "Just a little hiccup. I'll call the landlord today," Camille lied effortlessly. By 7:30 a.m., she had dropped Lily off at the free breakfast program at the local public school. Camille sat in the parking lot, the engine of the Honda idling roughly. She reached over to the passenger side to grab her cleaning tote, and her hand brushed against wet wool. Arthur's hat. It was still slightly damp, smelling strongly of Old Spice and rain. Camille stared at it, a flush of irritation warming her neck. She didn't have time to play lost and found. She should just throw it in a dumpster. The man lived in a mansion. He could buy 100 new hats. But she didn't throw it away. She tossed it into the back seat, put the car in drive, and headed downtown to the property management office. She had to try to reason with Greg before going to her cleaning shift. The office of Wallace & Sons Property Management was located in a strip mall next to a pawn shop. It smelled like cheap air freshener and toner ink. Greg was sitting behind his desk, eating a powdered donut and looking at a spreadsheet. He was a thick-necked man in a cheap suit, with eyes that always seemed to be calculating how much money he could squeeze out of the person standing in front of him. "Camille," he said, not looking up as she walked in, "unless you have a cashier's check for $850, plus the $50 late fee, I don't want to hear it." Camille swallowed her pride. It tasted like ash. "Greg, please. I just need until Monday. My diner shift got cut short last night, but I'm picking up a double on Saturday. I will have the money." Greg finally looked up, wiping a dusting of white sugar from his chin. Monday, right. Just like you needed until Wednesday last month. Look, Camille, I'm not running a charity. This building is an investment. You're a liability. I have an 8-year-old daughter, Greg. And I have a boss who breathes down my neck, Greg countered, leaning back in his chair. I told you Friday. If the money isn't in my hand by tomorrow at 5 p.m., I'm posting the 3-day pay or quit notice on your door. You can't do that. Camille's voice trembled, betraying her panic. I can, and I will. Nothing personal, Camille. It's just business. He turned back to his spreadsheet, dismissing her entirely. Camille walked out of the office, her vision blurry with frustrated tears she refused to shed. The cynicism she wore like armor was cracking, leaving her exposed and terrified. She got into the Honda and slammed her hands against the steering wheel. Once, twice, screaming a wordless sound of absolute rage. She drove to her cleaning shift on autopilot. For 4 hours, she scrubbed toilets, emptied trash cans filled with discarded lunches that cost more than she made in a day, and vacuumed plush carpets in a law firm. Every motion was fueled by a dark, simmering panic. $200. How was she going to find $200 in 24 hours? She could sell her car, but then she couldn't get to work. She could go to a payday loan place, but she was still paying off the predatory interest from a loan she took out a year ago for Lily's emergency room visit. At 2 p.m., her shift was over. She walked out of the high-rise building, the afternoon sky an oppressive, bruised gray. It was starting to drizzle again. She drove back to her apartment complex, intending to dig through her meager belongings to see if there was anything at all, she could pawn. Her mother's silver locket, her backup winter coat. As she pulled into the cracked asphalt of the apartment parking lot, she stopped. Parked directly in front of her building, taking up 2 spaces, was a sleek black town car. It stood out against the backdrop of peeling paint and rusted sedans like a diamond in a trash can. The engine was purring silently, and the windows were heavily tinted. Camille frowned, pulling her Honda into a spot near the dumpsters. She turned off the engine, grabbed her keys, and stepped out. As she walked toward the stairwell of her building, the back door of the town car opened. A man stepped out. He was in his late 40s, impeccably dressed in a tailored navy suit that screamed wealth louder than the car did. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, completely untouched by the damp pavement. He had sharp, angular features and dark hair styled with precise, ruthless perfection. He looked like the kind of man who owned the high-rise she had just finished cleaning. He looked around the dilapidated courtyard of the complex with thinly veiled disgust. Then his eyes locked onto Camille. "Camille Miller?" he asked. His voice was smooth, deep, and carried the effortless authority of someone who was never told no. Camille stopped at the bottom of the concrete stairs. Her heart kicked against her ribs. Debt collectors didn't drive town cars. Child Protective Services didn't wear tailored suits. "Who's asking?" she replied, her tone immediately defensive, crossing her arms over her cheap jacket. The man closed the car door behind him and took a few steps toward her, stopping at a polite distance. He didn't look angry, but he didn't look friendly either. He looked intently curious, dissecting her appearance with a clinical gaze. "My name is David," the man said. He reached into his inner suit pocket. Camille instinctively took a step back, but he only withdrew a damp, crushed felt fedora. Camille stared at the hat. Then she looked back up at the man's face, suddenly recognizing the shape of his jaw, the straight slope of his nose. "You're Arthur's son," she breathed. "I am," David said, his expression unreadable. "My father told me what you did last night. We need to talk." "We don't have anything to talk about," Camille said. Her voice was flat, carrying a defensive edge that had been sharpened by a lifetime of bad news. She tightened her grip on her plastic cleaning tote. It suddenly felt incredibly heavy. David didn't move from his spot on the cracked concrete, but his eyes dropped to her hands, noting the white knuckles, the frayed handles of the bag, the cracked skin around her fingernails. He was dissecting her poverty, calculating the threat level. "My father's 82 years old," David said, his tone measuring out the words like currency. "He has early-stage vascular dementia. I pay an agency a frankly absurd amount of money to keep a live-in nurse at the house. Last night the nurse fell asleep. My father unlocked the back door and walked 3 miles in a freezing downpour because he thought he was late for a train that stopped running in 1998. Camille swallowed hard. The irritation she had felt last night morphed into a cold, heavy stone of dread in her stomach. He hadn't been waiting for a bus. He was lost. "I brought him home," Camille said, her chin tilting up defensively. "I didn't touch his wallet. I didn't case the house. You can check your silver." David's jaw tightened. "I did. And I ran the license plate of the car that dropped him off on my security cameras. That's how I found you, Ms. Miller. I also ran a background check. You have 2 jobs, no criminal record, and a credit score that suggests you are heavily underwater." Camille felt the blood rush to her face. It was a suffocating, violent heat. The violation of it, this stranger in his $3,000 suit looking into her empty bank accounts, her late payments, her desperation, made her want to scream. "Get off my property," she spat, taking a step forward. "It's not your property. You rent. And based on the eviction notice currently being drafted by a Mr. Gregory Wallace, you won't be renting it for much longer." Camille froze. The courtyard spun slightly. The smell of the damp asphalt and the distant metallic screech of the city bus suddenly felt overwhelming. He knew. He knew everything. She was completely, utterly exposed. David reached into his jacket again. This time he didn't pull out a hat. He pulled out a checkbook bound in black leather and a silver fountain pen. He uncapped the pen with a soft click that sounded louder than a gunshot in the quiet afternoon air. "I'm a pragmatic man, Ms. Miller," David said, stepping out of the rain's drizzle and under the rusting metal awning of the stairwell invading her space. He smelled of cedarwood, starch, and wealth. "My father could have died last night. Hypothermia, pneumonia, hit by a car. You prevented a catastrophic outcome for my family. For that, I am compensating you." He scrawled a number on the paper, signed it with a sharp, aggressive flourish, and tore it from the book. He held it out. Camille looked down. The number was written in heavy black ink. $5,000. It was the answer to every immediate prayer she had. It was rent. It was groceries. It was a new alternator for the Honda. It was breathing room. Her hand actually twitched, a reflexive muscle spasm desperate to reach out and snatch the paper from his perfectly manicured fingers. But as she looked from the check to David's face, she saw the profound emptiness in his eyes. It was a transactional gaze. He wasn't paying her because he was grateful. He was paying her to wash his hands of the guilt. He was paying to turn her act of messy, inconvenient humanity into a clean, tax-deductible line item. If she took it, Greg Wallace won. The men who bought their way out of problems won. Her cynicism, the dark voice that told her everyone had a price, would finally be right. "Put it away," Camille whispered. David frowned, a genuine crack in his polished veneer. "Excuse me?" "I said put it away." Camille forced her eyes up to meet his. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird, but her voice steadied. I didn't pick him up for a payout. I picked him up because he was freezing, and nobody else stopped. You can't buy that off. David stood there, the check hanging in the damp air. Don't be a martyr, Camille. You need this money. I know you do. Yeah, I do, she said, a bitter smile touching the corner of her mouth. I need it so bad I can't sleep at night. But taking that money makes me an employee. It makes it a transaction. And I already have 2 jobs I hate. I don't need a third. She pushed past him, her shoulder clipping his arm. She started up the concrete stairs, her boots echoing hollowly. He fired the nurse! David's voice rang out, louder this time, losing its smooth cadence. Camille stopped on the landing, her hand gripping the rusted iron railing. She didn't turn around. He fired her this morning, David continued, turning to look up at her. He threw a bowl of oatmeal at her head. He locked himself in his study. He won't let the agency staff touch him. He won't let me in. And he won't take his blood pressure medication. Camille closed her eyes. The mental image of the frail old man in the wet suit, now terrified and lashing out in a massive, dark house, squeezed her chest. That's not my problem. He asked for you, David said. The admission sounded like it cost him something physical. He told me to find the woman with the rusted car and the angry eyes. He said you were the only one who didn't talk to him like he was a child. Camille turned her head, looking down at the man in the expensive suit. He looked suddenly tired. The arrogance had drained away, leaving a desperate son holding a check he couldn't cash for a problem he couldn't fix. The carriage house on the property is empty, David said, his voice dropping back to a quiet, rapid negotiation. 2 bedrooms, central heating. It's yours, rent-free. Plus a salary that matches what you make at the diner and the cleaning gig combined. You cook his meals, you make sure he takes his pills, and you sit with him. That's it. Camille stared at him. The drizzle picked up, pattering against the tin roof above them. I have a daughter, she said cautiously. The local elementary school in Pinecrest is one of the best in the state, David countered, without missing a beat. I will sign whatever residency paperwork you need. It wasn't a handout. It was a job. A hard, emotionally taxing job dealing with a declining mind. But it came with a roof that didn't leak, heat that worked, and a school where Lily wouldn't need a free breakfast voucher. Camille walked slowly back down the steps. She stopped in front of David. She didn't look at the check still pinched in his fingers. I need a $200 advance, Camille said, her voice hard as flint. In cash, right now. I have to pay off a bottom-feeder landlord to break my lease cleanly. David didn't hesitate. He folded the $5,000 check, slid it into his pocket, and pulled out a leather money clip. He peeled off 2 crisp $100 bills and held them out. Camille took the money. The paper felt rough and substantial against her calloused fingertips. I'll be there tomorrow at noon, she said. Moving didn't take long, when you didn't own anything worth keeping. By 11 a.m. on Friday, the Honda was packed to the roof with garbage bags full of clothes, a few boxes of dry pantry goods, and Lily's sparse collection of toys. Camille had slammed the $200 on Greg Wallace's desk at exactly 9 a.m., tossing her apartment keys on top of the bills. Greg had looked genuinely disappointed that he couldn't ruin her life. That look alone had been worth the bruising of her pride yesterday. The drive to Pinecrest Estates felt entirely different in the daylight. The menacing shadows of the old trees were just deep green leaves blocking the midday sun. The heavy iron gates were wide open. Lily sat in the passenger seat, her small hands pressed against the glass, eyes wide as saucers. "Are we really going to live here, Mom?" she whispered, staring at the massive stone facade of Arthur's house as they pulled into the circular driveway. "Not in the big house, Bug," Camille said, shifting the car into park. "There's a smaller house in the back. That's ours." David was waiting on the front steps. He wasn't in a suit today, but rather dark denim and a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Camille's car. He looked relieved to see them. "The carriage house is around the left side," David said, walking over to Camille's window. He glanced at Lily and offered a tight, practiced smile. "He's in the sunroom. He hasn't eaten since yesterday." "Show me where the kitchen is," Camille said, unbuckling her seatbelt. 10 minutes later, Camille walked into the sunroom carrying a tray. The house was exactly as she had imagined it. Vaulted ceilings, dark mahogany floors, and an oppressive, suffocating silence. It smelled of lemon polish and old, dry dust. It was a museum, not a home. Arthur was sitting in a high-backed leather chair, staring out the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at the manicured lawn. He was wearing a thick wool cardigan. He looked smaller than he had in the rain, frailer. The anger David had described was nowhere to be seen, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. Camille set the tray down on a small glass table beside him with a deliberate clatter. A bowl of warm tomato soup and a grilled cheese sandwich, cut diagonally. Arthur didn't turn his head. "I told the other woman I don't want anything." "I'm not the other woman," Camille said. She pulled up a wooden chair and sat down opposite him. "And it's a grilled cheese, Arthur. You're 82, not 8. Eat the sandwich." Arthur blinked, slowly turning his head, his cloudy blue eyes focused on her face. A slow, tentative light flickered behind his gaze, pushing back the fog of his dementia. "Camille?" he rasped. "Yeah, it's me. You're not driving your car today. It's raining." He looked confused, glancing toward the window where the sun was shining brightly. "It's sunny today, Arthur. The rain stopped," she said gently, correcting him without pity. "Your son hired me. I'm going to be staying out back. I'll be cooking and keeping an eye on things." Arthur looked down at the soup. His hands trembled slightly as he reached out, not for the spoon, but toward Camille. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before extending her own hand. He gripped her fingers. His skin was paper-thin, cool to the touch. "You brought me home," he whispered, a tear pooling in the deep wrinkles beneath his eye. "It was so cold." "I know it was," Camille said, her throat tightening. The cynical armor she wore to survive in her world felt utterly useless here. This man didn't want her labor. He just didn't want to disappear into his own mind alone. "But you're inside now. Eat your soup." Arthur finally picked up the spoon. Later that evening, Camille sat on the porch of the carriage house. The air was crisp and clear. Inside, she could hear the quiet hum of the central heating unit. Lily was already asleep in her own room, tucked under a blanket that wasn't damp. Camille held a mug of cheap instant coffee she had brought from the old apartment. She looked out at the sprawling, silent estate. She hadn't won the lottery. Her life wasn't magically fixed. She was essentially a high-paid servant to a man whose brain was slowly betraying him, working for a son who threw money at problems instead of facing them. There would be bad days. There would be days Arthur wouldn't recognize her. Days he would scream at the walls. Days she would feel trapped in someone else's golden cage. But as she took a sip of the bitter coffee, she realized she wasn't listening for the sound of her landlord's boots on the stairs. She wasn't calculating how many miles she could drive on a flashing fuel gauge. She had stopped for a stranger in the rain, dragging her own heavy baggage into the storm. And somehow, the stranger had handed her a key to a different kind of life. It was messy, it was deeply imperfect, and it was tied up in a stranger's tragedy. But as the porch light flickered on, casting a warm, steady yellow glow across the dry pavement, Camille took a deep breath. For the first time in years, the air didn't feel so incredibly cold. If this story hit a nerve or made you feel something real, don't just scroll past. Hit that like button to support stories that matter. Share this with someone who knows what it's like to fight through the rain, and subscribe for more grounded, deeply human storytelling every week. Your support keeps these stories alive. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Camille's shoes? Let's talk about it.